Last Mother's Day, I told you the story of Ruth. And so today I think I'm going to follow in suit and tell you the story of another courageous woman. Her name's Esther, and her story is found in the book of Esther. And this morning, it's a long story, and I am going to have to leave parts of it out, and I'm only going to be able to read one little section in a little bit. So I would encourage you, sometime this week, read this story. It's really a great story about Esther. I'm just going to kind of give you the shortened version of it this morning. But the story takes place when the Persians are a world power. Actually, they're the world power. And King Xerxes was the king of the Persians, Persia, which is modern-day Iran and Iraq. The kingdom in those days went from India to Ethiopia. And so they were the world ruler. And he was very proud of all that they had accomplished. And so he decided, King Xerxes decided to put on a 6-month display of the power and the wealth of the Persian Empire in the capital city of Susa, where he lived. And so for 6 months, there was all this stuff going on, celebrating how powerful they were and how wealthy they were. And then at the end of the 6 months, they had a week-long banquet or celebration. It lasted for an entire week to celebrate all the great things that was going on there in Susa. So, you can imagine, this celebration was held in the king's summer home. So there were hanging gardens and tapestry. There were silver and gold couches on mosaic tile. Food of all sorts all over the place. Nothing was held back. It was just an incredible week-long party. There was an open bar for a week. Yeah, so treat yourself. So meanwhile, Queen Vashti had a separate party for all the women of the kingdom back at the royal palace. So the women were over here having their celebration. The men were over here having their celebration. And along toward the end of the week, the men were feeling no pain. And the testosterone and alcohol were flowing, which is often a fatal combination. And so Xerxes came up with what at the time he thought was a great idea. And he sent word over to his wife, the queen, Vashti. I don't think I mentioned, Vashti was just drop-dead gorgeous. And so he sent word over to her to put on that little black number that he liked with the heels and her crown and come over because he wanted to parade her around in front of all of his drunken friends to show them what a beautiful wife he had. As appealing as that sounds, she turned him down. She said, "No way, Zerk. It'll be a cold day in Mesopotamia before that happens." Well, he couldn't believe it. He's the king. Everybody does what the king says, and he was angry. So he called his advisors together, and I'm telling you, I'm not making this up. This is in the Bible. This is what happened. The advisors get there, and they said, "Oh my, if word gets out that the king's wife disobeyed him, man, our lives will be miserable. Our wives will stop obeying us. Women will start doing whatever they want to do. They'll take over. We could end up with peace in a functioning society." What are we going to do? This is terrible. Next they'll want to vote. So we better nip this in the bud. So they convinced him that he needed to punish Vashti, and the punishment should be severe, that she should be banished from his presence forever. And so he agreed, and it was done. Now, in hindsight, this is far greater punishment for Xerxes than it was Vashti. She may have actually been relieved. And I like what Frederick Buechner said. He said, That's how Queen Vashti lost her throne, but kept her self-respect, and there seems to be absolutely no question as to which of the two she valued more highly. So later, Xerxes sobered up and cooled off and realized he had made a terrible mistake. And so he was sad, he didn't know what to do. So once again, his advisors came and said, well, I'll tell you what, to cheer you up, we'll get you a new wife. And so they didn't have to twist his arm. That's what they wanted to do. So now living in Susa at this time was a man named Mordecai. And Mordecai was Jewish. But he had been brought into the Persian capital in exile when Nebuchadnezzar was king. And Mordecai had a niece whose father and mother had both died, and he took her into his home, and he raised her like his own daughter, and her name was Esther. So when they started this contest to go out and try to find all the most attractive young women in the kingdom, Esther happened to be an attractive young woman, and so she was one of the ones that was chosen, and so the contest starts. It's like Persian's Next Top Model and The Bachelor all rolled into one, with a few other makeover shows put in there, because they had 6 months to prepare to get ready to meet the king. And long story short, Esther won. Everybody liked Esther. The king fell in love with Esther. And then Mordecai told her, he said, it'd probably be best if you didn't let anybody know that you're Jewish. Some things are just better unsaid. And so she didn't tell a soul. So meanwhile, back at the castle, there is a man named Haman. And Haman had worked his way up to becoming the right-hand man to King Xerxes. And there's another incident that I don't have time to tell you about, but it angered Haman, and he hated Jewish people. And so once he got this position of power, he was going to take his anger out on them. And so he decided to ask the king's permission to round up all the Jewish people in Persia and kill them. So anti-Semitism has been around a really long time, and Hitler wasn't the first to come up with that idea. So he went to the king and asked if he could have permission to round up all the Jews and kill them. And Xerxes thought, well, why'd he care? He wasn't a Jew. He didn't know any Jews. So what did it matter if Haman took care of them? And I'm reminded every time I read that of that famous quote from the Christian pastor Martin Niemöller, who was a pastor in Germany during the rise of Nazism and Hitler. And he said, they came for the socialists, but I didn't speak up because I'm not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I'm not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I'm not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up. Injustice toward anyone is injustice toward everyone. And when we tolerate hatred of any group of people just because it doesn't affect us, then we have strayed far from the life that God has called us to live. We are not truly free unless everybody's free. And so Haman sent word throughout the kingdom that on a certain day all the Jews were going to be rounded up and they were going to be killed. Well, when the word got out, Mordecai heard what was going on, so he sent word to Esther. And here's the scripture that I want to read to you. This is what happens. It's in chapter 4 of the book of Esther. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and to explain to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence and to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. And then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they shall be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I've been called to go into the king. But Esther's words reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. So Esther went to the king. She risked her life in doing so. But when the king saw it was her, he spared her life, asked her what she wanted, and she said that she wanted to have a banquet, just the two of them and one special guest, Haman. And so when Haman got word that he was invited to a special banquet with just the king and the queen, he was quite proud of himself. It actually turned into 2 banquets. And then at the second banquet, Queen Esther told the king that someone wanted to murder her and her family and all her people. Well, the king was enraged. He said, who would want to do such a terrible thing? And he wanted to know. And Esther pointed to Haman and said, it's him. I'm a Jew. And so are all my people. Well, all the blood left Haman's face, and the king stormed out angry. And Haman pleaded for his life unsuccessfully. He ended up being hung on the gallows that he had prepared for someone else. So in the end, all the Jews were saved, and Esther proved to have even more courage than beauty. The Jewish holiday of Purim, which is celebrated to this day, is the celebration of Esther and her courage saving her people from massacre. A little interesting side note, the book of Esther is the only book in all the Bible that never mentions God. Not even once. Now that doesn't mean God was absent. It just means that God was working through the courage and the love of ordinary people. How God still works through the courage and the love of ordinary people. The Bible is a patriarchal book. And so that's why stories like Esther are just so spectacular. Stories about women like Ruth and Naomi and Vashti and Esther and the Hebrew midwives who disobeyed Pharaoh and spared the male children, and Pharaoh's daughter herself who disobeyed Pharaoh and raised Moses. Mary, the mother of Jesus. Mary Magdalene. All the women who stood at the foot of the cross and who went to the tomb, who were the first to witness the resurrection. And Lydia and Phoebe and Priscilla and Philip's 4 daughters, and the list goes on and on and on. In a time when women were no more than a possession, there were women who lived with character and grace that changed history and honored God. In our minds, we tend to mix all the gospel stories together, and so we have this like generic picture. But sometimes it's important to try to forget what the others say and just look at one gospel. And what do we know if we just, for instance, if we only had the Gospel of John, if that's the only one we knew and the only one we'd ever read, we would have a different picture of Mary, the mother of Jesus, than the one we have. To begin with, John never mentions that she was a virgin or a virgin birth. Not that it's not true, but that wasn't important to John. And John is the one who exalts Mary more than the other Gospels. So in John's Gospel, Mary is not exalted and cherished because of some immaculate conception or perpetual virginity. She is honored in John's Gospel because she's Jesus' mother. And she brought him into this world. And she loved him. And she cared for him. And she wept at his cross. And for John, that was enough. She was exalted because of her human motherhood. That's what John celebrates. I think that's kind of cool. So today, we celebrate mothers and all women who are models for us. Mothers, grandmothers, wives, sisters, daughters, single or married, women whose greatest and most lasting virtue is their character. John Wesley said, "I have learned more about God from my mother than all the theologians in England." Me too, John. Me too. So all you mothers and all you women who have made a difference in our lives, today we celebrate you for what you do and for who you are. So from the bottom of our hearts, thank you. Happy Mother's Day.